In this video, we're going to talk about the community of practice model as described by Levin Wenger. Overview, first we're going to talk about assumptions about learning because understanding community of practice and what it has to do with learning is a shift in those assumptions. Then we'll talk about community of practice itself, and then finally, legitimate peripheral participation, which is a key part of community of practice. Learning assumptions. So Wenger outlined these in 1996 to help people start thinking differently about learning. Here's some assumptions we often think of. We think learning is an individual process, that it has a beginning and an end, that it's separated from other activities in our lives. We go to school and learn and then we're done. And that teaching is required for learning. Okay, so think about these assumptions. How many of these assumptions do you take on in your thinking about learning? So the community of practice theory kind of pushes against these assumptions about learning. And just as a reminder, we talked about theory before. It's an idea, model, or set of principles that explains observation. So it's a way to frame and look at something. We can prove it false. We can't really prove it true. And so this is just another perspective we can take on learning. One more review, Vygotsky. Remember Vygotsky? Vygotsky had this main idea that every function in the child's cultural development appears twice. First on the social level, and then later on the individual level. First between people, interpsychological, then inside the child, intrapsychological. So that went along with that zone of proximal development, where you're first learning between people with support in the zone of proximal development, and then it becomes internalized. Now you'll notice the thing in Vygotsky is focusing on how an individual child or individual person develops. Community of practice is a little bit different because it focuses more on the knowledge and the learning of a whole community. Although it still does talk about individuals within that community, the knowing itself is placed with the community instead of an individual. So the famous book on this is Situated Learning by Levin Wenger. This was 1991. And, there have been some critiques of this more recently about, we won't go into it in this video, but Wenger has some newer work, some newer ideas on this. But here are the main principles. First is that learning is situated in an environment, not in individuals. So you think of what is happening across individuals and the knowledge of a community versus just the knowledge of an individual. Individuals develop through the community. Identity is connected to learning in the community. So becoming something, like becoming a cat, I think I showed you before. That's a key part of it. And then learning is integrated with the work. It's not something separate. It's part of life, part of the work life. So they identified three main elements for a community, and this is actually a little bit later they called them this, but this is the more common terminology now, that there's a domain, which is your area of shared interest, your community, those are the relationships that you're building, and then practice, and that's your body of knowledge, methods, stories, tools. So we don't need one person that knows all the practice. We can have different members that know different parts of the knowledge, and they work together in the community. And that's what it means by the knowledge is in the community, not necessarily in individual people. So a key part of this is called legitimate peripheral participation. It's kind of a mouthful. So let's break it down. First of all, legitimate. The participation of an individual is real. They're doing real valuable work. Whether they're brand new or they've been in it a long time, every member is doing something real and valuable. It's peripheral. And what that means is that their activity or participation is not central. You can think of it as there's a lot of different ways to participate, and that participation can change. And I'll show you an example. And then participation means they're an active part of the community. So Levin Wenger built this and explained it off of some case studies of apprenticeship. So how to become a midwife, Another example was how to become a tailor, a clothing maker. So let's say that we want someone to deal with legitimate peripheral participation as they become a tailor. First of all, let's say they're an apprentice and they join a community. In the community, there's a master tailor that's the old timer. They know everything about being a tailor, or at least a lot of stuff, most of the stuff. And we have our new apprentice here. At first, the apprentice doesn't make all the clothing. Perhaps at first they just sweep up the floor, right? That's a valuable, legitimate role, but it's on the periphery. It's not a central role to the community, but it's still important. And then maybe they learn to start cutting out patterns. And then maybe they sew on buttons. And eventually they become more and more a participant, a more and more full participant in the community until they become an old timer. So learning is becoming a part of this community, building an identity in this community. And it comes through that legitimate peripheral participation. So I want to show you an example with music. This was a few years ago. This was my nephew. He plays the viola and he learned through the Suzuki method, which is a common method in the United States for learning string instruments. And a big part of Suzuki method is having kids of different ages play together and learn from each other. And so this was at the end of the summer camp, and it kind of just shows the community that was at this summer camp. All the kids joined together for this concert. So you'll see you have some younger kids down front, you have some older kids, and there's actually even some professional musicians up here. And they're going to all play together. So let's listen to a little bit of it. So that's one group of kids. These younger kids aren't playing yet, but they're going to start playing later, and they still have an important role. Right? So they're all there. They all have an important role to play. And then I want to skip ahead because there's a very part that this is what makes me think of legitimate peripheral participation. Sorry for the shaky video. So here you see you've got some little ones. They're 2 and 3-year-olds. They're not old enough to play a string instrument in this song, but they can still participate. They can still be part of it with the maracas and the world flags. Still a legitimate part of the performance, even though it's not at the same level as others. And in a couple of years, they're probably going to be one of those kids down here that's going to play. And then maybe in a couple more years, they'll be on the main stage. So that's what we mean by legitimate peripheral participation. One more thing I want to show you. The very end of this, want just to show you what happens here. I don't know why the audio is weird there. So you see at the end, they have their arms up in the air like that. That's kind of a thing that string players do at the end of a song, and it just kind of feels good to do it, and professionals do it. So it's kind of a practice that they're teaching the younger children to do to feel more like that identity of a string player. Okay, so Let's review these common assumptions again and think about how community of practice interrupts these assumptions. That learning's an individual process, it has a beginning and end, it's separated from other activities, and that it requires teaching. How is community of practice? How does it disrupt these assumptions? And then think about the difference between community of practice and the zone of proximal development. What is similar and what's different between these types of theories? Final takeaways. So community of practice, main areas, it has a domain. It's an area of a shared interest. It has a community, which is relationships around that interest. And it has a practice, which is a body of knowledge, tools, and methods, etc. Finally, members of the community of practice engage in legitimate peripheral participation, moving towards a more central role in the community, although no one in the community is totally essential. So that's another way of thinking about learning. Thanks for watching.